Start in 30 seconds. If you want to finish our conversation, we're going to have another 25 seconds. Welcome.
I think the unlock is over here.
Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome back to SOM. And I am Saul. I'm assistant professor. In about 5 days, I'm going to be associate professor. In the finance group, and a lot of my research is on entrepreneurship, innovation, and of course, the financial aspects of all those problems. And from the method side, a lot of what I do is basically to apply a lot of modern techniques like machine learning, AI, and so on and so forth into business education as well as business practice. And I know that we have a huge span of classes here. Okay, let me take a look. Okay, who come from the 82? Okay. 87. There we go. 92. Yeah! Whoa! 97. And 2002. And 2007. Okay. And then 12. And 17. And I wanted to count all those years. I want to first highlight two important years for me. I mean, the first one is 1987. I want to tell you this is the year that I was born. And the only reason I mention it is like if I say anything naive and stupid, you should forgive me. Okay? And a lot of you know SOM longer than. And the second important year here is 2017, which is the year I taught the first class at the SOM. I joined SOM in 2016, and the first ever class I taught was in spring 2017, and I believe the earliest class that I ever took my entrepreneur finance and venture capital and private equity course is 2017. And I have a habit of taking pictures with every class I ever taught. Nice. And I believe this was 2017 class. You can see me minus 20 pounds in that picture. And I just want to say, like, it has been a great journey for me at SOM. And also, it's great to see a lot of you even before the class that I ever taught. And the second reason that I wanted to show you that time horizon is that if we look around, okay, there are many things that don't change about SOM. I'm going to talk a lot about that toward the end of it. But at the same time, one thing we need to acknowledge is that the world is changing so fast, which raises a lot of questions about business schools, about business professors, and about students who are in business school or who were in business school. And just to name a few of them, for example, even when I joined the SOM in 2017, at that moment, AI, machine learning, and so on was actually just at the starting point of actually start to be applied in different jobs and so on and so forth. But right now, it is one of the hottest areas. And even business school students are trying to learn a lot of those techniques in order to really kind of do the jobs that are required. And also, the 82, 87 class perhaps have experience of that, but a lot of them perhaps already forgot the sense of inflation. And right now, this is an important hot topic that we're trying to deal with, right? And you perhaps never heard about Bitcoin 10 years ago, right? And now you heard a lot, and you perhaps hurt a a lot when you talk about Bitcoin as well. And also we talked a lot about how even rethinking about the word capital and capitalism. If we actually think about all the things we want to take into consideration when we do business school, and when we teach all those courses, and so on. This is a much milder transition for the School of Management at Yale, but for a lot of traditional business schools and so on, this was a much huge impact for them as well. And for those of you who graduated before 2014, we even changed the building, right? And I actually never worked in the old building. I've heard a lot of good things about it, and also heard a lot of bad things about it. And but the thing that's absolute is that we changed a lot. Okay, so that's naturally raised the question of, can our education keep up with all those changes in the world and the business world, or in the world in general? And also, can the research and the things that we bring into the classroom, okay, keep up with all those changes, okay? And in order to give you a sense, okay, of what is happening, and both in terms of the fact of the research, as well as what we're thinking about the the fast-paced changing of the business education, what I'm going to do today is basically to lump two of my research projects into this big theme of what do big data teach us about business and business education. And here's what I plan to do. I'm going to do two research projects that are solely made in Yale SOM. Basically, all the co-authors are students or faculty members in the school, and actually a lot of data points were actually contributed by my class. Okay, basically I run experiments on them, and there we go. And you're going to see what we can learn. Okay, and these are also the things that I teach in the classroom as well. The first project I'm going to show you is basically to give you a sense of what kind of new machinery or new technologies we're bringing into research, and then the insights of which will be brought into the classroom. This is the paper called Persuading Investors, a video-based study, where I'm going to show you how I'm going to leverage video-based data to really tell us the decision-making process in investment practices and the biases that could arise from that practice. And the second thing is actually to look into the educational content itself, where I'm going to show you if I actually collect millions of university syllabus, okay, and then compare them with the frontier knowledge and the main issues in the world, how are we doing as an education institution, okay? And what kind of things can we learn about higher education, okay? With that, we're going to hopefully use the next 15 minutes smartly. I'm going to present a little bit, but at the same time, you always are welcome to just raise your hand, tell us your name and class, and then ask a question, okay? And if anything that I kind of developed as a habit when teaching here is that if the room is silent for roughly 5 minutes, I actually got pretty nervous. I would feel like, you know what? I maybe lost most of them, and I don't want them to happen. And I don't have a TA to write down your participation, so it's all based on your motivation here. So the first thing I want to show you is a very, very simple project. Simple in the sense that it is so intuitive, but also it's a very modern type of empirical research, basically research that uses data to tell us how we are really doing in the real world, and hopefully have important implications as well. And this is a joint work between me and a PhD student here that is finishing a degree here at SOM. His name is Alan. And then the idea is very simple. Now you have been in this business world or in any context working for many years, and a lot of the economic decisions that you face are made after interpersonal persuasions. For example, for corporate executives, you're going to pitch strategies. If you ever started a startup, you're going to pitch to the investors. And the sell side analysts will pitch stocks and so on and so forth. There are a lot of those contexts where the interpersonal persuasion that I try to persuade you to do certain things, to invest in me, and so on. It's just very, very common. It's every day. It's part of our life. Okay? It's part of. In fact, it is how the business world economics functions. And what matters in those persuasion or in those interpersonal communications in general? The traditional view is very simple. The content. You're going to show your past performance. You're going to show your strategy. You're going to show how strong your founders or your team are. You're going to present your vision, and so on. Those are all very reasonable, right? Those are the important things. And of course, you want to make it interesting. That is where the second bullet point about framing comes in, right? Basically, even if you have the same raw material, if you kind of combine them in a certain way to frame it under a big picture, and so on, that will make it look interesting, attractive, that's important. But it's still part of what we say, the content. But one other thing that I thought that was missing when we think about this kind of persuasive interpersonal communication is what I call how you deliver your persuasive presentation. Okay? That is not about the content. That is beyond them. That is your facial expressions, the tone of your voices, and the specific word that you're going to choose when you say certain stuff. Okay? As someone said, well, it is not what you say that matters, it's actually how you say it. Right? How are we going to control your facial expressions, control how passionate you sound, and so on and so forth. And therefore, I really wanted to understand the following research questions. That is, do those features that, like the facial expressions, the tone of your voices, the dictions, and so on, matter for economic decision making? Okay? If it is something that is an important determinant for that, is that a good thing that we take that into account, or a bad thing? Because perhaps you would feel, of course, that matters. But aren't you curious that is that actually good? That we bring someone into our office, starting to talk to this person, and then actually go, oh, this is such a passionate founder. This is a great presenter, and so on. Is that actually a good thing or a bad thing? Does it lead us to make better decisions or worse decisions? And does it actually affect people from different demographics with different experiences heterogeneously? The main challenge, of course, is that even though we have a lot of interpersonal communications happening in the world, for example, over this long lunch that you just went over, perhaps you sat with somebody, you talked, you laughed, you had a lot of great memories shared, and you have a lot of jokes and so on, but nobody else knows, right? How can we actually systematically record all those interpersonal communications? And meanwhile, even if there's a creepy economist here, right, who actually took videos of you talking to each other, how are we actually really going to analyze it to see whether that matters? Okay? So the key novelty, which is also what we're really kind of trying to apply to the new type of research that we want to do, is really to think about, to use modern tools like machine learning and AI to help us get at this question. The novelty of this approach is that we're going to use video as data, so we really have the recordings of a lot of those persuasive communications in the business context, and apply a machine learning-based framework to process all of those communications. We're going to be able to track at the frequency of 1/10 of a second of how your face looks, what's your tone like in your voices, and the specific word choices. Are you going to use words that generally give people a warm impression, or are you going to give people an impression that of being a very cold person because of the specific word choices? And we're going to apply all those techniques in the setting where startups pitch to venture investment. We're going to use the recordings from pitches by startups where we can observe their pitch video. We actually can follow to look at the investment decisions after the investors viewed all those communications. And then we can also follow to see the real performance and whether the startup was successful afterward. In this way, you will actually be able to answer the question about, did it matter? And was that actually a right decision? Because you were swayed by how this idea was presented. Okay? So, how are we going to collect all those kinds of data? The specific data source we're going to do is that, how many of you heard about this thing called incubators? So it's like Y Combinator and so on. It's basically small, like a group of investors making investment in a systematic way to early stage startups. So you basically submit a business proposal, and when you submit it, okay, they typically require you to submit a recording of your pitch. Okay? And here's what's beautiful about it. When they ask you to submit all those recordings, they don't ask you to send the file. They ask you to submit it to YouTube and then send them a link. And guess, if you submit to YouTube, who else can see these videos? Someone like me. Therefore, I basically script the whole YouTube for those kind of videos. And I will be able to link back to the investment decisions, which are also public, by those investors. And we will be able to track the performance of those startups, okay? And the startup pitch to the accelerators or incubators are typically 1 to 2 minutes long, and which are standardized. And it's an important part of the application process. For those of you who lived through the past 2 years, you know this is basically a Zoom pitch that you're going to see on Zoom, okay? And then we just have recordings of all of them. And you see a lot of high quality videos. For example, those are 2 female graduate students out of Stanford who were doing an education related startup and then later got funded and so on. And then we can track a lot of the information about those startups, including their founder profile. We can observe their industry, financing history, CEO turnover, founders' education and work experience, growth and success, and so on. So with all those data that you will be, starting from how they pitch to whether the firm made the investment in them, and also to look at their round after round of financing, survival, and employment growth. We have a lot of material to work with in order to answer the questions that we have. So the core of this methodology, and perhaps something that you'd be interested in, is to think about, okay, you are a creepy economist who actually videotaped everybody, right? And then how are you going to use those videos? And can those video methods be applied to other settings as well, right? So what we do is a 3-step process to really apply all of those videos into our understanding of investment behaviors. The first step is what we call the decomposition and the representation process. And under this big name is actually a very simple task. That is, each video comes in, we're going to extract 3 sets of information out of it. The audio track, the images, extracted at a very high frequency, and also the verbal part, which is the specific script that we can automatically generate it from the presentation. And then after you got all of those, we will be able to leverage the modern techniques of machine learning and AI. For example, this is from the video part, this is from the visual part, which are pictures. You will be able to analyze the videos frame by frame through facial detection and emotion algorithms, which will allow us to look at, okay, are they laughing? Are they looking at each other? Which can help us to track team chemistry, right? Who talks more, who talks less, who looks more confident, and who looks less confident. All those things, you will be detect them at 1/10 of a second frequency, basically 10 images per second. And for a standard 1-minute video, that is 600 pictures. And you cannot ask people to really rate this. It is only the machines who can do this in a consistently reliable way. And then for vocal, you will be able to detect their sound waves and create variables from that as well. For example, those are two pitches from two real videos. Those are the sound waves. If I ask you which sound wave looked a lot more passionate, you would perhaps think, okay, there are a lot more up and downs here. And then here, perhaps halfway you already fell asleep. Here, right? But here it's a lot more passionate and positive and so on. Those are the type of things you can ask machines to do to help you. And also, for the verbal part, you will be able to get all those words that people say and match it to psychology-based and business-based dictionaries that can help you to categorize which are the type of words that show warmth and sympathy, and some of them are the words that show less of them. Okay? And then the third step we have, after we decompose them into 3 different streams, process them, is that we can combine all those together to actually create a variable that can allow us to capture in general how well or how passionate the presentation or pitch was through what we call this pitch factor, which aggregates the 3V features, which is the visual, vocal, and verbal features. And you can see those this pitch factor, okay, this pitch factor loads positively on dimensions like visual positivity. Basically, you smile a lot. And on the arousal and balance, basically the vocal sound sounds very passionate and positive, and also on the fact that you load heavily on the warmth factor. Okay, so the naive interpretation here suggests that while the pitch factor captures the unobserved overall passion and positivity that you show in your startup pitch. Okay, so the methodology, even though you feel like it's somewhat complicated, but in the end it boils down to something really intuitive. Okay, it boils down to something really intuitive, which can allow us to just show very simple analysis to actually get at the questions that we were asking. Just to remind you, what are we getting at? We're trying to see whether how you presented in those interactions really mattered for the decision making, and no matter if you are from the presenter side or from the decision-making side. And the second is that a good idea that you incorporate all those ideas, all those features, okay? And does it lead to better decisions or worse decisions? If it leads to worse decisions, why that is the case? Okay? And what kind of mechanism does it go through? And what are the potential corrections that we can use to correct that? Okay? To correct that. Now I'm going to show you 4 results. The first result is basically, yes, they do matter. Okay? And how many of you still remember how to read a bar chart? I actually reminded myself this morning. And if you basically cut all those videos into 5 different beings, from the lowest passion, which is the one to the left, and the highest passion, which is the bar to the far right, and you will be able to see the higher pitch factor, basically the overall positivity and passion you show in your pitch is associated with a much higher probability of obtaining funding. A 1 standard deviation increase in pitch factor is associated with more than a 1/3 increase in the probability of obtaining funding.
Okay? That is almost bigger than getting an extra degree. So basically, if you smile more, you actually could have saved the 2 years you spent here. Okay? And that's how useful this thing was. And the persuasion rate is basically to look at the top quintile and the lowest quintile. It's going to be doubling it. Okay? It's going to be doubling it. This is, I suppose this does not come to you as a surprise in any way, right? For many reasons. We lived a life, we know the type of people we interviewed or the type of behavior we want to put out when we are being interviewed. Then the question is, well, is it simply because the better pitch person runs better startups? Okay, meaning I'm just picking on the right dimensions because there are all those ideas about, oh, for a startup, a founder, we really want the passion. Someone who really are passionate about the idea and so on and so forth. Okay? So if that is the case, then you would imagine those firms who pitched better and got the investment and so on would have potentially better outcome. Right? In that case, that would confirm this naive interpretation that, well, it's simply because those are better startups and the founders are more passionate about it and so on. But in all the dimensions that we looked at, including future success, employment, raise for future big VC fund, and survival, and so on, what we found is that conditional on funding, the P team who showed more passion and positive, in fact, underperformed compared to the others. Okay? What's the interpretation? The interpretation is it's certainly not that the people like who are more passionate and so on and so forth will causally just run a worse startup. But the idea is more like because the people who just show more passion and so on give an easier path in the investment. And gradually, when the true qualities show, the average quality of that set of people, okay, and startups will just gradually decline. Right? You give the investors were making mistakes by giving them money, and it will bite them in the long run. Okay? And so this is basically where we are halfway. We are already halfway there. Basically, we show, okay, pitch delivery, it matters. It does not seem to be helpful to help you do profit maximization. Okay? Instead, this could be some sort of a bias. Okay? It could be some sort of a bias. And the bias part, you can think about potentially two biases that comes in. The first one is what I'm going to start from the bottom one, which is what we call the taste-based. That is, I just want passionate, positive people in my office and around me. Okay? Because I think they're potentially I just like that atmosphere, that type of culture. The second is what we call the inaccurate beliefs. So basically the idea is that I actually invest in them simply because I gave them a wrong probability of success. I thought I know the business, and I thought the passionate people would run a successful startup, but I attributed too much into it. Therefore, I incorporated that kind of information in my investment decision. So that's kind of what we want to tease out. But even before going there, one small thing that I want to kind of take you through is actually to show you that the effect I showed earlier, actually in this setting, actually have a gender perspective in it as well. What I can show you here is that if you actually look at single gender teams, which is the upper half of this graph, to look at all men teams and all women teams, which is basically you can show that the effect is largely similar but with different intensities. That is, the investors will judge more based on those pitch features on women-only teams compared to the men-only teams. But the really surprising thing comes from the bottom half of it. Okay? This is something that I didn't hypothesize when I started doing the analysis, and it jumped to me, and I had to better understand it after talking to my colleagues, which is, if you look at mixed gender teams, in the case, for example, if my wife and I are having a great idea, well, we don't really have one yet, but assume we do, and we're going to go and pitch in your startup, in your VC, and hopefully to get funding. And what this longer bar on the man and a smaller bar on the woman basically means that whatever I perform will carry the most weight. Well, whatever she performs will actually carry lower weight in the real investment decision making. Well, in my household, it's totally the opposite because my kids don't really care about what I say, and even if I perform to be like really angry and so on, it doesn't really matter much. But this is a finding that is surprisingly robust, okay, and basically it confirms with a lot of the experience of female startup founders. But we still have one last thing we need to really do, which is whether the mistakes that are made because of incorporating all those presentation features because of taste-based, or it actually is because of inaccurate beliefs. This is where I really asked for help from the Yale MBA students. All right, so basically, I had entrepreneurial finance and venture capital and private equity classes, and you perhaps remember if your professor right before submitting the grades and ask you to do a favor, you perhaps would like to do that. And they did, right? And basically, it's a very fun exercise, by the way. It's a very fun exercise. What I did is basically to send them, each of them, okay, 10 random videos and say, you're going to be working as if a venture investor, okay? You're going to look at the pitches, and then you're going to make your investment decisions. And what I ask is 2 big sets of questions and 3 small questions. One is, are you going to make the investment in the startup that you just saw the pitch of, okay? The second is that do your best to give your prediction about what's the success probability, okay, of those startups if you make the investment. Okay? And the third one is I'm going to ask you how confident you are with your prediction. And then why I ask those questions, you perhaps can imagine, is that I would like to see whether the pitch factor, okay, was going through changing the probability in your mind or not. Does it change your confidence, basically narrowing your confidence interval or not? And what I found is the following. What I did find is that pitch factors affect how you feel about the success probability. That is, you are assigning, or the investors assign a much higher probability of success to the startups that show higher passion and confidence in their pitches. And if you try to decompose this whole effect, you can see that if you remember the 2 channels I mentioned to you about inaccurate beliefs and taste-based, what you can see is that more than 80% of this mistake can be attributed to you were saying, okay, the people who are passionate and positive and so on and so forth run a better startup. In fact, they don't, okay? So we thought we know the business, but in fact, it's far from the truth, okay? So to give you a sense of this project, before I actually started to take questions and also to kind of see how we can expand this to other practices, is first, to deliver features in persuasion matter for economic decision making, and through what economic mechanisms. The methodology is basically use a video-based method, and the conclusion is that yes, they do matter. It does not come as a surprise, but instead of thinking about you're getting extra valuable information, you want to think about whether you are actually making a potential mistake by relying on this part of the information, because based on this study, there's an inaccurate belief channel that makes can lead to a potential room for error. Okay, so I'm going to take questions before I move on. Go ahead.
So,
Name and class.
I'm sorry, Mark Zemmel, 07.
Welcome back.
Venture capital is sort of it's a unique subset of investing in that you're trying to hit home runs,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
maybe I missed this early on, but, 1 out of the 10 is the one that's going to return your fund, or 2
Yes.
out of the 30 or whatever, right?
Yes.
So, when you do your analysis, right, are you looking for, because the average business is not going to do well, right? And it doesn't
Yes.
matter whether, I pick one that's a bad pitch and they do 10% better.
Yes.
Right? I need the one that returns the 10x.
Exactly.
In your analysis, which are the ones that give the 10x?
So basically, okay, so I just want to give everybody the context. I don't know how many of you have heard about the power law in the VC investing world. So basically the idea is that the whole VC business is based on getting the top 2 or 3 deals in the fund. In fact, out of 10 years, if you can make one of them, that totally changes your multiples, all of the exit, and so on and so forth. And the Mark's question is basically, when I look at my performance, am I looking at the average return? I was mainly looking at the average, right? And how about the big exit, the big wins, the home runs, and so on? The reason I showed, you didn't miss anything, the picture I showed was mainly on this average return techniques. The reason is, at that moment, when I did this research, those startups, which are mainly the past 6-7 years, did not have a huge room for them to really do exit yet. But now, in 2022, we actually did a simple pick and then see, and you can see that the exit returns, as well as the probability of going IPO and reaching to unicorn status and so on, is also potentially higher as well. So basically you have a little bit of that going on to confirm what you just
So
said.
you're saying that still that the better pitcher doesn't necessarily give you a better chance at the home run?
Oh yeah, no. In fact, not really. I mean, if you actually think about the opposite, right? Instead of home run, I don't know what's the opposite of home run actually. and if you actually think about who are the scams that were really in the news, think about Theranos and so on, they're the best presenters.
Right.
And then so therefore, if you actually look at that dimension, you can also confirm this in the opposite way.
I have a question. A lot of times entrepreneurs, Paula Bolin, in 1997, a lot of times entrepreneurs are very isolated and insular, maybe on the spectrum, and maybe not do great presentations. And also, a lot of times pitches are done by IR, investor relations people.
Yes.
So does it have to be the founder that does it?
That's a good question. So in general, I think what you just said, we're totally right. Basically, towards the later stage, when the firms are bigger, they're going to have a special, they even can hire people to train the founders to actually say the right things in the right way and so on. But those are generally the early stage startups that the firm was only 2 or 3 employees. The team is 3 to 5 people. Sometimes all of them are on and so on. So this is a specific stage of that
So
we're
you would
looking at.
say that the more inarticulate they are, the better the success is?
Well, I mean, that's why I don't want to do that attribution there, but I guess the right interpretation is that in the real world, the better presenters get an easier way to raise funds. But therefore, in the long run, when the true quality shows, the investors who made the investment in such founders will have a lower return. I wouldn't say that they're just run better startup. It's more like investors make mistakes by investing. Yes?
So I was curious what your sample size was,
Yeah.
and also how many had this higher pitch in your sample size?
Yeah.
And how did you account for just the quality of business that they came with?
Yeah.
Perhaps, the business plan was a lot more sound in some instances, so how do you account for that?
Yeah, exactly. So basically for this paper, the sample size is 1,039, I believe, and spanning 5 different incubators that we could get, basically script YouTube and get their videos off. And how many of them are of the higher pitch? I think it's all about how we think about the benchmark. So basically, because if you remember that bar chart, I have to basically looking at this and then which are higher and so on. The next natural question would be, well, how high in general compared to a regular person like me, right? And actually I did a simple pitch by reading out one of the scripts just to see on average how well we do. Okay? And I scored in the bottom quintile. And therefore, on average, those are pretty passionate pitches and presentations. And regarding controlling for the quality of the idea and so on, this is a very subjective issue to basically look at their quality. And then if I have a secret recipe to really judge that, I perhaps would be doing something else. But one of the things we could control is to look at founders' education, business experience, past entrepreneurship experience, whether they have patents in this, controlling for different type of industry, and so on. Do the best we can to make sure that we're comparing apple to apples in their quality and business plan dimensions. Okay? Yes, please.
Hi, Carrie, class of '97. I feel like I've heard some similar outcomes when it comes to persuasion of juries and outcomes in the
Yes.
in law. And
Yes.
I'm wondering what other industries have
Yes.
you compared your data
Okay,
to?
perfect. I mean, you know what? Why don't I use it? I'm going to come back to this question. I'm going to dump the second part of my presentation, and then just keep this conversation going. I miss you, 2 over there, but I'm going to use the 3, 4. I'm going to use this on opportunity to look at the potential broader implication of those when you try to do your own business and so on, and what kind of business are really applying those kind of technologies. This is not something you can, this is not something that's just do in ivory tower, and this is something that are really being applied. On the one hand, there are businesses that I am working with, basically to try to play the other side, basically use those kind of exactly the same technologies to train people to present better. Okay, to train people to present better. And the specific startup that I'm working with is called Talk Me Up. Okay, Talk Me Up is a Pittsburgh-based startup company that basically you go on and then you have a small video that you basically can train. And then the specific idea that I'm exploring is actually to give those kind of training to the people who really potentially needs it but don't have access to it. And that are from the lower income families, community college students that we are basically trying to give this access to. Because if you are in a school like Yale, you will get a lot of support from your classmates, from the career people, and so on and so forth. But these are not the things that are available to the people who just graduated from community college and going to their first interviews, cannot get advice from their parents, from their peers, and so on about those. And those kind of machine learning driven technologies is the easiest to scale up to give them that. All we need to do is to give them an account number and a password. And then they can log on, find a computer, right? I mean, that's a separate issue that we're dealing with, actually, how to give them computers and a stable internet. But if you give them, that's the thing that we actually can do. Like, you will be able to give them, let's say, this is your overall score, okay? And those are the 3 things that you can say, okay? Or you can improve. For example, the tips are going to be something like smile more, use more numbers, use more connecting words like because of or whatever, right? And also give more gestures and not shaking too much. And those kind of things are the specific tips you can give. So basically this is one specific applications that we can do.
But on the other hand, there are also ways that we can basically guide on people who are making those kind of errors to try to minimize it. For example, I'm working with the Yale's entrepreneurship the Tsai Center. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. Basically, it's a center that does a lot of activities to sponsor student entrepreneurs, innovators, and so on and so forth. And every year they have a launchpad, a program, basically give them money, give them space. It's kind of a small Yale-run incubator. And for example, one specific idea that I give them is that you need to first rate on the paper before you see the pitch. That's a very, very simple message, right? You need to use all the hard information first, form your opinion before you got affected. The second is that we actually can estimate a person-specific, basically a judge-specific bias score on those kind of things. It's not like everybody is biased. Trust me, if you actually run the experiment on MBA students of our own school, you see everybody is biased in a certain way. Right? And it's not like you're wrong or right in doing this, it's just part of your decision-making process because of your experience. And if we actually estimate the score, we will be able to add a correction on all the scores that are submitted. Right? And the same thing applies, for example, if you are doing a broad recruiting exercise. Right? A lot of the big banks and so on and so forth, at this moment, the first round already turned into only machine reading. Right? In that way, you will be able to take out a lot of the things that you're subtly affected by. For example, the type of accent, right? And what kind of suits and so on and so forth they're wearing. And so on. So in this way, by acknowledging the potential problems in those interactions, particularly in those quick process without a lot of huge amount of due diligence in the early stage, maybe using those kind of more standardized machine-driven, technology-driven techniques would actually help us to correct a lot of the errors and biases that are in the process. These are the few applications that this whole exercise have kind of branched into. I missed two, I missed one.
Mine is pretty much answers.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Mike Ostrom, I'm 19, so it's a weird carryover from a year, a couple of us. But this is really interesting because you could say that this is a bias that needs to be cured. Or advice that venture capitalists that say, hey, don't believe the hype, don't invest in over-enthusiastic people or whatever. But conversely, it could also be a team issue and timing issue for that company. And by that I mean, nobody's going to write a check for Wozniak when he and Steve come. If he's by himself, he's not going to have the enthusiasm or anything like that, right? But if it's just Steve running the company, yes, it's probably not going to do well from the beginning. Right, so there was a phase where Steve was enthusiastic enough to get support. Wozniak helped build the functional core. Steve actually left for a time.
Yes.
And then Steve came back, and as that role as sort of the cheerleader, enthusiastic, dynamic, charismatic person, he could then scale. So I'm curious to see if there's a dynamic of timing there for that type of person. Or in other words, it's not necessarily, maybe training the sort of less dynamic operator type folks to get the investment, maybe it's not enough.
That's a very interesting interpretation. I would say like Steve Jobs perhaps added more than just the charismatic personality and so on. He also had the vision, I would say.
I don't want to sell him short, but
again, the point. I guess my response is that I think I would say that perhaps is one potential lesson for the entrepreneurs. Basically, when you do your startup, potentially having very diverse background and strength actually would be a good thing, right? You want to have different strength covered by the startup team, and including actually obtaining funding if we know the VCs are looking for certain type of startup companies, right? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Augie Del Rio, class of 2012. A lot of the models, fascinating stuff by the way, so thank you for that. A lot of the models the focus that I've seen in the model is based on the startups and the founders.
Yes.
I wonder if you can also incorporate it or if you've done it for different models where you take into account the audience, right? So for example, do women-based VCs or geographical-based or different sizes of funds?
Yes.
How do you incorporate that with the actual, the founders themselves?
That's a fascinating suggestion. So I think, let me just rephrase this question, which is, okay, at this moment, we're keeping the investor side a black box, basically keeping it as some person and or some reviewer and so on. Maybe the experience, the demographic differences, the work experience and so on and so forth of those investors could also play an important role. The answer is absolutely yes. The reason I couldn't explore it explicitly in this model is that, remember, I only got the data from scraping the website. Therefore, I only know the public information about whether they got invested. I was so close to getting one incubator to sign off for me, but as soon as they heard that I'm going to say that they have a bias and making mistakes, they actually backed out. And I don't blame them. I think that's the right thing to do for them from their legal team. And but remember, I have a lot of material to work with on our Yale MBA experiment. Therefore, when I run an experiment, I actually did ask about your work experience, your undergrad degree, and so on and so forth. Right? And what I found is that there's not a lot of factors that can make you avoid this kind of mistakes. This kind of mistakes are pretty universal, and seems that this is just something that we all should pay attention to. Of course, I don't have much of a sample size there, but that's kind of my impression from the small sample that I worked with. But that's definitely a right direction for me to look into a bit more. Yes, please.
Yes, Juan Pablo Ibarra, class of 2002.
Yes.
I'm curious if in your research you identified what creates this bias, right? Is it emotional triggers? It clearly has, it has this positivity translates.
Yes.
I view it as a smokescreen,
Yes.
right? That's hiding what's really behind.
Yes.
That's my takeaway from today, and it is our job in these processes to try to look behind for whether it's
Yes.
the right competencies or
Yes.
whether it's the right, things that will actually correlate to performance, right?
Yes. Yes.
But what's triggering this big shift?
Yes, yes. I mean, so I'm speculating here, okay? I'm speculating here. I don't have solid evidence on any of the things I'm about to say. But I'm going to categorize them into two potential sources. The first is just from the very basic psychology traits that we developed over our growth period. All right? So basically, I think there are a lot of psychology research that are basically show, for example, even babies like smiling faces. This is just make you feel safer and make you feel more comfortable. That perhaps where you get all those taste-based biases there. But the second is that we are basically reinforcing a misperception, okay, about, for example, we tell a lot of the stories. We tell a lot of stories about Steve Jobs, like, for example, being a very charismatic person, positive, and so on and so forth. And you also look at a lot of the startup founders who survived this endeavor and become really happy on TV. And you keep reinforcing this, saying like, oh, look at all those entrepreneurs who became very successful. Look how positive they are. Look how passionate they are. Look how positive they say they are. Right? And how passionate they say they are. All those things reinforce this misperception that gives you this wrong probability in mind to the investors that, okay, we need to find this kind of entrepreneurs to make investment. And that basically explains the misperception or inaccurate beliefs that create from there. Right? That's kind of my speculation.
Correlation is not implied causation.
Yeah, exactly. Or basically, this is basically the probability of the probability calculation in your mind, right? Basically, okay. Good. Yes.
Good question. Vlad Gavrilovich, class of 2017. So, if I
You were in my class, were you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
right? So, thanks. Thank you. So if I get things correctly, right, like, I mean, who's gonna give money to somebody that is not, charismatic? But the probability of success is something that goes, it's just a statistical probability. It's really small, and that's gonna be, and that's just the fact. So, like, what's the alternative to this? You gotta be confident when you're presenting. That's
Yes.
kind of common sense.
Yes.
It doesn't give you a probability of success, but do you have a speculation or a data? Like, if you're confident and you really put some thought, obviously, you perceive confidence through hopefully showing some numbers and you did the right, research and somebody's agreeing with you, obviously signing your check. Like, why is that, like, they are so wrong? Or are we just looking because they were so loud? The probability of them failing is what, like 19 out of 20? So, is that we just pay attention to it because they were loud? Or there is something that, overconfidence kind of impacts the performance down the road? Or like, is there something that can be learned out of this to, if you were one day from the investor standpoint, and once you become an investor, like what am I looking into down the road as a possible things they can.
If I were to give investors advice here, right, that's what I give to the Tsai Center review process and so on, which is we want to delay those interactions until after you started the review, after you actually finish the materials and already get the score. Imagine what you are perhaps doing in the practice is like, okay, the startup is about to pitch to you. 1 minute before you log on the call, you bring the paperwork in front of you and then start reviewing while you are listening, right? And then that's perhaps exactly what you do, right? But what I would suggest is that do that paperwork beforehand, give it a score, and listen to the presentation, and then try to think, okay, where is the discrepancy from, and am I attributing almost too much into the presentation itself, rather than looking at the specific hard information that were provided by the hard evidence, and so on. And the second would be knowing everybody's biases. For example, if you actually look at Sequoia, they actually have all those kind of behavioral economics lectures to their partners. Starting from 15 years ago, right? And then what they do is basically to tell everybody, you have a bias, you have a bias, you have a bias. Let's actually try to figure out a way to take out our biases, right? To take out our biases. And that is basically my suggestion to the investors. We should do more of that, and this hopefully is one way to actually give hard evidence for them to do that. I'm happy to answer more questions, potentially after the presentation, but I have 1 more minute, so let me actually tell you just 2 sentences from the second half of my presentation. I never got a chance to show you. So basically, the second part of the presentation I wanted to show you is what I did with another professor at the economics group of Yale, called, her name is Barbara Biase, and what we did is basically to look at university syllabus, and then to look at whether universities are really teaching the up-to-date materials into their classes, okay? For example, the things that I show you that are very up-to-date, new materials and so on, are we bringing that into the classrooms? And then the only conclusion that you need to remember is that Yale SOM is doing just fine. I actually asked for 20 years of all our syllabus and did analysis on Yale. And we are doing just fine. And you made the right choices by coming here. So I'm now going to show you